So, how can we find conflict? That is the question then. How do we actually find the conflict inside of our story? Because we show up, we get an email from a mortgage broker, which like first of all, thank you. That was the best example you could have given us. And we're like, desire? I don't know. Conflict? Come on. Right? And that's often what happens. But again, that golden rule of improv is yes and. And it's there. How do I find it? Where is it? So we're going to share 3 techniques we use to help find the conflict inside your story.
But first, we're going to go through the 6 universal conflicts that we have. So the 6 universal conflicts, and to go through this, I want you to put on your thinking caps after watching Van's story, right? And let's talk through each of these different conflicts in relation to her story. So the
And
first
let me
is,
just set up that idea just to make sure people
mm,
get it. The theory goes that there are actually only 6 conflicts in the universe. Every problem, every challenge comes back to one of these 6 conflicts. And those 6 conflicts are man versus man, self, society, machine, nature, spiritual. And Maddie's going to take you through example of what those mean in a second. But the idea here is that there are actually only 6 conflicts. And so if we start with those and apply them to our story, we can start trying to find what could the potential conflicts be. So with that said, let's apply Van to the 6 universal conflicts and think about what they might be.
so man versus man conflict, right? Let's think about that. That's 2 people against each other. In the context of Van, Patrick made a reference before about someone at the restaurant saying that he didn't want her there.
What's another man versus man conflict or woman versus woman conflict?
That you could find in the Van story. So everyone
Or
was
that you
like,
could imagine in her life. It doesn't have to be something you saw in the film. Yeah.
The bus driver.
Yeah.
the
So
bus driver not letting
her against the bus driver. That's a story in and of itself. And we're coming back to your answer right here. Like how you could make this episodic. That is a story in and of itself. Just her against the bus driver trying to get accepted to be able to go on the bus and be like anybody else. Absolutely.
Her and her friends. So what would be an example of her and a friend?
Her friends said she couldn't be a model and she should come up with another dream.
So as we get into friends,
That takes us over to man versus society or woman versus society because that's multiple people. And again, in Van's piece, so that's the third across, we skipped self, she was saying everyone thinks that people with disabilities aren't beautiful. Everyone was telling her she shouldn't do this. Everyone was telling her, why do you have these dreams? That's Van versus the society around her. So that's a perfect example. Then if we go back one, let's go Van versus self. What are some of the conflicts that Van may have encountered? I'll give you one to give it a start. Go.
Can she actually do it?
Can she, so self-doubt. Can Van actually do it?
what did she say at the opening of the film?
Yeah, cameras.
The biggest thing I'm afraid of. Yeah, she would say, like, she would tell us that when she'd get ready to go out, she was terrified to look in the mirror before she left, just because she couldn't see herself. So, huge struggle with yourself of, can I even do this?
But also her dream of modeling, the essence of that is photography and
Mhm.
being filmed. So her already having to overcome that.
Huge,
Huge.
huge.
And so there are heaps of other things as well. Maybe if you go Van versus herself, maybe it's her disability too. Maybe that had something to do with a conflict that she encountered along the way. But you can see each of these are a different story. And so as we continue, let's do Van versus the machine. And that's not a new band name. That's Van versus machine. Maybe that's when the fashion show is about to start and the mic's not working.
What other man versus machine conflicts could you think of for Van? Which is machine, technology, anything like that.
You have one over there. The wheelchair.
She could get a flat, whatever, right? Like in her wheelchair.
And even just, I mean, we're getting really creative now and thinking like flat tire and stuff like that. And, does that actually happen? But just the idea that I want to be a model and I have a wheelchair, and how do I overcome this thing and still be a model? Right? But the challenge isn't with me and myself now, it's me against this machine that I have to be in to move around. And how do I embrace that?
And then the next one, man or Van versus nature. Any ideas here?
Ultimately, what got her disabled to begin with.
So you're thinking spiritual more. So the last one, spiritual, is going to be any kind of godly or haunted natural force, something like that. Haunted films are often, or horror films are often a man versus spiritual conflict. A fight with your God would be a spiritual conflict. But when we say nature, it's less of the DNA nature and more of trees, forest, fire, winds, that kind of thing.
Richard's got one.
Like the day of the event, rain clouds come overhead.
Raining on the day of the event. Yep, exactly. So
What
I'm
other genre could that work really well in? What other genre of film could rain be an incredible conflict for you? Yeah, weddings. People struggle so much with how do I create any kind of conflict or struggle or journey in a wedding film. And if you actually have the bride's dream desire was the amazing wedding outside and it's raining, that alone is this massive conflict that you want to see can, what actually happens. Right?
And then finally, van versus spiritual, which we had before, which is, oh yeah, you've got one?
I have a question. If this was caused by Agent Orange exposure, their disabilities or whatever, is that man versus nature, or is that how would you?
It depends how you're positioning it. Is it, what is the societal forces that caused the Agent Orange? It would be man versus self if it's just that your body's diseased, right? Like if you've got cancer, that's man versus self. But then it could be you questioning why you were born like this, which is man versus spiritual more, right? Like, why is this happening to me? It's not a struggle with myself, it's out there. So what's really important to see, and the whole technique here, is to try and take these 6 universal conflicts and think about and apply them to your story. Take your mortgage broker and go, what's a struggle they have with somebody else? What's a struggle they have with themselves? What's a struggle with society? And you start to find these different elements. Each one of those could be a really strong story. We were trying for one central conflict. So our goal was be that we would have one central conflict. Anything else that comes up needs to serve that central conflict, right? So what do we think the central conflict was in Van? What type was that whole story? And to figure that out, you can also think about the different things that came up and what did they consistently point back to.
Her versus self.
So how does her versus herself relate to the 6.7 million people in Vietnam who have disabilities, to people not being allowed on buses, to how people try and commit suicide if they have a disability, to people saying that you can't have a dream like this, people saying that you can't be a model?
I think you've sparked it. Society.
Right?
Yeah.
The central conflict there was man versus society. Now within that, her challenge against herself and getting outside and all that, but it serves this larger thing that she's trying to overcome society. If, she had a conflict where her tire broke down, on the way to the UN meeting, does that actually serve her battle against society? Is that really related? Not really. So that is the common thing that reality TV does, is we'll insert a conflict that's not necessarily relevant just because conflict creates engagement, right? So your challenge as the storyteller is to pick that central conflict. In this one, it was man versus society, her trying to redefine what is beauty, and then the other conflicts we found serve that. Her challenge against herself served that. That make sense?
Yes, Justin.
I have a quick question. Does the story length or the project length determine how many conflicts you try to have or how few you try to have? A 3-minute film versus a 2-hour piece?
Yeah, I think, so our next section will get into overall story structure and how this all comes together. But what you'll notice is a longer story generally has a longer journey. The desire and conflict are very early on. They are the beginning of your piece, right? We get to know a character, they run into a problem. If your conflict happened halfway through, you're spending half the movie or film going, what's going on, right? Where's this going? So those happen early, then it's the journey to overcome. So what you find is a strong conflict, a strong singular conflict is great in a piece that's 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. Even 7, 8, you can kind of get away with that. As you get longer, the journey gets longer and you need more things to get in the way. So you need more conflict serving that as you get into a 22 or a 44 or a 2-hour kind of thing, which you'll see in any Hollywood film, right? There's the big central problem that Matt Damon gets stranded on Mars and, is left behind, but his journey to overcome has all these little problems that come up along the way. If he didn't have those, you'd get bored. If it was just him doing things and everything worked perfectly, then he got home, you'd be okay. So you need those conflicts to serve it. So longer means more conflicts. What science says about the effectiveness of short form pieces, 3 minutes and less, is that simple is best. Simple characters, simple conflicts, less elements. Really trying to just make it very, very clear when you're doing something short.
And so with these 6 universal conflicts, a really great exercise when you have the mortgage broker story, Or when you have a new story that comes your way, a client has a story you want to tell, find your characters, look at their desires, and then trial out, just like we did with Van, each of the potential conflicts: man versus self, man versus man, society, machine, nature, spiritual. Brainstorm it all out. What are you most interested in? What is the most compelling story that you find from that?
Okay, number 2, the second technique for helping to find conflict is what we call look both ways. And so the idea here is that you're trying to follow the path forward and backwards to find potential conflicts. So say you're doing a commercial film for a coffee shop and you're going, what? What is the conflict here? So what's the main ingredient in a coffee shop? Coffee beans, right? So in applying the idea of look both ways, we're going to look backwards and forwards. So we've got the coffee beans in the coffee shop. What happens before that? Where might they come from?
Whole Foods.
We've
Very
got
good.
to, it's where they're sourced from, right? So we've got to actually acquire the beans. Where do they come from before that? A field somewhere or a distributor. Then we get to the field and the planting, and each, as we go back, has potential conflict. Your story of the coffee shop could actually be about fair trade ingredients or direct trade or the sourcing of the beans or how the beans are grown and how they're grown this way and that allows them to be more flavorful, or how the traditional way of growing beans is actually often overcooked and burnt and that kind of thing. But go beyond just where it is now. Going forward, we'd look at what happens if I bring the coffee home or, and I give it as a present or like that kind of thing. So looking both ways outside of just the immediacy of somebody pouring a cup of coffee. And as you follow that chain forward and back, you can start to find other elements of conflict.
You had a question? Yeah, sure. So one of the things, I'm a big coffee buff. And so one of the things that could be a great sign of conflict is who is the barista making the coffee? Like if you actually speak to someone who's really passionate about coffee, you'll find that the pour is so precise. You have 26 seconds on that pour. And you've got, if you look at all the work that comes from harvesting a bean, it all comes down, all those years of growing and learning how to grow and harvest beans, down to that particular moment of that 10-feet drop of that pour. So maybe it's down to the way that they make their coffee, brew their coffee, pour their coffee.
Whenever you have anything mediocre, like you're working on, a wedding film and you're feeling that the people don't really care, or a commercial film or whatever, always go to desire and look for conflict there. Because what the people want is where you're going to find less mediocrity. So give me an example of something that coffee shop might want. They just buy their beans from Safeway. They don't really care. Like what is something you can imagine that they might want?
Good customer service.
They want amazing customer service. And so the conflict is about how in Portland, there's so many coffee shops and untrained baristas and nobody really gives a shit anymore. There's not any real relationships or connections. We make sure that we have just a few people on our team that are here all the time. You get to know them, we know you, and we believe in really creating community in our area where you come in and we know you. There you go. Desire conflict, right? So find what they want, and in that, you're going to find a challenge, something that they're trying to overcome. Cool. That makes sense? Look both ways? Okay, Maddie, number 3 is what we call active avoidance.
Yeah, so this is something when P was talking about before, ahead of this Australia and New Zealand trip, I had to do all these darn interviews with all these people, right? And I was really excited about it because I got to meet so many different people for this story. But as I'm talking to this one guy, and he works at this huge state emergency services, and he drops everything in a bat of a hat to jump out in the field when there's a flood and help. And so I said to him, well, why do you do this? How did you get here? And he kind of told me this really story like, oh yeah, so I moved from Perth, which is the opposite side of the world in Australia. I moved from Perth and now I'm here and I just joined the community. Oh really? Why did you move from Perth? Oh yeah, I was just looking for something different, but then I got here and so now I'm here. I just was looking for ways that I could rejoin and make some new friends. And so I kept talking to him, and you can hear, and he keeps repeating the same sentence, just a little bit differently, right? But he's avoiding the huge chunk of why he moved from Perth over to the other side of Australia. right? The whole conversation. So it clicked. And it's like, yeah, but something would have had to happen in Perth. Why? And then from that, this huge story unfolded. And so what you're doing during these interviews is really listening to the answers and responses you're getting. Because the thing that they might be avoiding, which is a really common thing, right? If you're embarrassed about something, if you feel shy about something, if you're nervous about something, are you going to bring it up the first time you meet someone? Exactly. Challenge, but also listening for that active avoidance of the real reason why they did what they did. And so this is a really effective way and a technique of spotting what the character isn't talking about so that you can find that conflict, because they hide it. I would too.
Now, as we went through the 3 techniques for conflict and 3 techniques for desire, hopefully you're starting to see a pattern that as the storyteller and the filmmaker, it's so much more than just what people say. It's not about me coming up to you and just asking a question and taking that. It's about how you say it. It's about what you fill your life with and the observations I can make. It's about what you're not saying, right? We have to be curious to find those things that help create a full picture of why somebody's doing what they're doing, what this is about, and that journey. If we just walk in and ask a couple questions and take those answers and build a film, you are back to a commodity. You're back to what anybody can do. But the more you can discover and be curious and find other things, you can create something completely different. Okay, so bringing these ideas together, hopefully we can see that a character with desire runs into conflict, right? That's what we're trying to get at. A character with desire runs into conflict. What does a character with desire create for us as the audience? Empathy, emotional connection. We feel it. We want it for them. What does conflict create? Engagement. So we really want it for them, and now we're engaged to see if they can get it, right? You see how those are the 2 magic elements. What happens if I have a character with no desire that runs into conflict?
Why do I care?
I'm engaged, but I don't really want it for you, right? What happens if I have a character with desire with no conflict? It's the friend that got up and, his dad bought him his way into university, right? If we're not working for it, if you don't really have that. So we need conflict overcome and we need the desire. That is the engagement and that is the emotional connection.